Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video I want to talk about lectures 6 and 7 from the Stuart Hall book. And hopefully you're still enjoying this book, even though I think at this point we're definitely on some more complicated ideas. I think we've certainly come a long ways from the idea of cultural studies as being about great works, and that Matthew Arnold view, really getting into realms of ideology and hegemony. A lot of terms you probably heard several times that maybe not really sat down and thought a lot about. So maybe you have. But either way, I think these chapters or lectures are great for that kind of reflection. So in this first one here, the lecture 6, ideology and ideological struggle, Hall says he wants us to rethink the nature of ideology and the possibility of struggle on the ideological terrain. So you remember some of the earlier thoughts about ideology was that it simply means something like false consciousness, brainwashing. The ruling class, the dominant class, is able to coerce people to believe in a certain way that's bad for them and good for those in power. That's a sort of a simplistic view, I think, according to Hall. As we'll see, Gramsci. So he says he wants us to get beyond this simplistic view of just good and bad meanings. Also, this idea that it all comes back to discourse. Everything's a matter of what we say about it. That's what's really key. That one might seem a little strange to you, but there was this great shift, the linguistic turn in philosophy and elsewhere that Hall's going to be talking a little bit about in these chapters. Also, the idea of ideologies being something fixed, forever, by the way, in which particular unconscious processes are resolved in infancy. So I think there he's referring to Lacan, and that's kind of beyond the scope of what I'm prepared to talk about. But I think the gist of this is that, again, the idea of this being the ruling ideas, or that this is something that we're born with and can't change, or that we're trapped in, whether we like it or not. All those sorts of ideas Hall wants to surpass or challenge. So ideology not only reproduces the social relations of production, but sets limits to the degree to which a society can easily, smoothly, and functionally reproduce itself. So here you can see where there's a little more flexibility, a little more play with ideology. So it does, I suppose, reproduce the social relations of production. But it also does this other thing, right, which sets limits to the degree to which that society can change. Almost think about this as kind of the friction. So if you want to make a change, it's not going to be easy, especially depending on if it's a radical change, but you'll be rubbing against the ideology. So they're not always already inscribed, but rather a class struggle in language. So in this first one here, or chapter 6, he's talking mostly about Althusser. And he says again, Althusser made some good points. He's opposed to class reductionism, this idea that whatever the social class you're born into, working class, bourgeoisie, whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean much. You might jive with the ideological position that's good for that class, or you might not. I think we have plenty of examples of this. Rich and powerful people who are part of the elite, as it were, but you hear them talk and you see the sort of things they're getting up to, and they actually seem to be working against those class interests. Maybe they're proposing more taxes that would affect them. Or maybe they're in favor of some kind of environmentalism that would hurt their bottom line. So you see that kind of stuff all the time in the real world. And so I think it's just kind of common sense, right? That obviously just because you're a member of one class doesn't mean you're automatically going to have this set of predispositions. Let's see, moving on. Yeah, here's another idea that he takes from Althusser that's useful. So the idea of the ideology, what can you do about it? Um, he says that the sort of, I guess, the ideological agents have to be continually produced and reproduced. The labor not reproduced inside the social relations of production themselves, but outside of them. This is where he's starting to get into this idea that if we think back to that base and superstructure model, we don't want to say that the base is where everything important happens, right? But also looking at anything from the family structure, maybe your family at home, the church you go to, schools, all of these can sort of serve this role of maintaining a labor force, as it were. And this is a good point here, I thought, where Hall's criticizing some of Althusser's ideas from that ideological state apparatuses. And he says that really, Althusser talks a lot about the dominant class, and that is ideology, but where's the ideology of the dominated classes? And so he says he sees kind of a creeping Marxist functionalism at work there. Doesn't really acknowledge all the counter tendencies that we know are there. There's a lot of resistance, exclusion, deviation. So where do you really find the class struggle in this model? And he seems to think that's a pretty major flaw in Althusser's framework. He says ideologies are the frameworks of calculation and thinking about the world. The ideas which people figure out about how the social world works, where their place is in it, and what they ought to do. So that's all fine, but the problem is whether ideas, mental events can happen. Is everything physical? So this is getting back to that materialism idea of, I don't know if I should put it that way, but this idea, does everything come back to sensory data or materialism? Is it all, we're always talking about stuff, and if so, where ideas come in? Yes, we could say, well, the only way we can get at the ideas is to look at expressions of those ideas through practices or rituals or whatever it is. So that's the, I guess, material representations of those ideas. But that's not the same thing as saying that we don't have ideas that are just purely mental. And so we don't really need to get into that aspect of it, I don't feel like. And then he goes ahead and jumps a little bit into Gramsci and the problems of hegemony. He says, really the boundaries between the state and the civil society are not easily defined. We have all of these private institutions of civil society. He uses this term, the theater of consent, at one point. And I'll save some of this discussion for later, but he talks about the state. And again, Althusser talks about this as well, the state apparatuses, ideological or repressive state apparatuses. So he's saying here that there's some sort of strange issues that we get into, such as if we think about the media in our society today. Supposedly these new CNN or Fox or CBS or whatever it is, it's not as if the state is telling them what to broadcast on or giving them rules about what they can say on their programs, right? Maybe you believe that's true, but I guess consensus is that's not what really happens. This isn't a totalitarian regime like where the government basically tells the news, gives these agencies the news to report on and censors everything. So let's just say we believe, well, it is free and they can make all these choices. Yet isn't it strange how structurally they all seem to share the same biases? This very limited repertoire within these. And it's funny how you can go from network to network, and there's some differences there, but a lot of it seems so similar. And it does seem to have more tight structure than you would expect if it was genuinely a free press. So I think the thinking here is again that to understand why that might be, we need to go beyond just saying, well, it must be the government, or it must be the ruling class at work again. Those sorts of answers, and really sort of embrace a more complex response to that. He also says, talking about individual subjects, again, where do we have room for agency as individuals within a society or culture? In Althusser, he says we talk a lot about the category of the subject, that being what's important, and also this idea of interpolation. And so, if you're familiar with ISAs and the RSA essay, this idea of interpolation comes up a lot. And Hall here says it's when we are hailed or summoned by the ideologies which recruit us as their authors, their essential subjects. So the example, I believe, in Althusser, if I'm remembering this, it's been a while, but you're walking down the street and a police officer yells, "Hey, you!" You turn around because you're sort of accepting that this you, it's just you. Could have been anybody, but you're the one that turns around. So you're kind of becoming the subject of that discourse. So that sort of idea, but broadly conceived, is that's how you sort of get into this ideology. You sort of recognize yourself within it as the subject. It's pretty heady stuff, but I think if we come back to this idea of ideologies as being sort of the lens through which we make any kind of sense of the world at all, and our place within it. At what point does that happen, right? How does it come to be that we are interpolated into this ideology? It's a pretty interesting question, and of course, Hall wants to reject this idea that it's just something that happens in infancy and it's something that we have no control over. Here he says Althusser erred when he was treating ideology and interpolation as separate things or separate parts of his book. I really should have focused on their relationship. And so let's zero in here, and then I'll give you a chance to respond to some of these ideas. So this seems to be a key idea for me from this chapter. He says the social is never outside of the semiotic, or discourse, or language, or whatever you want to call it. Every social practice is constituted within the interplay of meaning and representation and can itself be represented. There is no social practice outside of ideology. However, the big however here, however, this does not mean that because all social practices are within the discursive, in other words, we can talk about them, therefore there is nothing to social practices but discourse. All practices are in ideology or inscribed by ideology, but practices are more than just ideology. So there seems to be quite a bit of insight in these passages here. So I just pause. What do you make of what Hall is saying here? Do you agree or disagree? Why or why not? All right, so to move forward, he goes on to talk about systems of representation. He says the key word there is systems, not system, because there could be many different systems of representation. He says ideologies are not single ideas, but chains, formations. And he says you can't just go into one of these fields and pick out, a piece here and there and make any sense of it. Because as soon as you talk about one aspect of it, it triggers off a whole chain of connotative associations. So he says the notion of the dominant ideology and the subordinated ideology is an inadequate way of representing the complex interplay of different ideological discourses and formations in any modern developed society. So we seem to be light years away at this point from those simplistic views we talked about at the start of this. So we're not saying there's the dominant ideology and just one subordinated ideology. Instead, there's a whole bunch of different ideological discourses and formations going on. and it could be quite bewildering. He says it's not possible to bring ideology to an end and simply live the real. We need a variety of systems of representation. So again, I always think about something like Plato's allegory of the cave, if you're familiar with that, or if we could just take the red pill from the Matrix and get away from ideology, and then we could just see things as they really are. So Hall seems to be saying here that there's no way to do that. It's the best you can do is swap out one system of representation for another one. He says some of these different systems, though, might be better than others for particular relations or situations. So some ideological categories may give us more adequate or a more profound knowledge of particular relations than others. So again, it's not that one system of representation is the right one, the true one, and the other system of representation is ideology or false consciousness or lies. Rather, it's just, I guess, more situational as to which might prove more useful to you at any given time. Okay, so then he brings it back to his theory of articulation. So I'll just read this part again, and you can respond. So, a theory of articulation is both a way of understanding how ideological elements come under certain conditions to cohere within a discourse, and a way of asking how they do or do not become articulated at specific conjunctures to certain political subjects. So, again, it doesn't seem to be a lot of reason behind some of these articulations, right? You could have situations of very strange bedfellows, to come back to that expression again. So it's not always predictable how it's going to work out. He says the theory of articulation asks how an ideology discovers its subject rather than how the subject thinks the necessary and inevitable thoughts which belong to it. It enables us to ask how an ideology empowers people, enables them to begin to make some sense or intelligibility of their historical situation without reducing those forms of intelligibility to their socioeconomic or class location or social position. So here, if we come back to those earlier notions of structuralism, where there was almost the idea of a process without a subject, or that, putting sort of imagining culture working as kind of a machine, I suppose, and everything has its proper place and its role, and we're all just sort of cogs in this machinery somewhere. So we're well beyond that sort of thinking at this point, and even looking at ideology as something that can empower people, to enable them to, not only is it not just brainwashing them with lies, far from it, actually enabling them to begin to make sense of a historical situation. And, may or may not have anything to do with where they are on the socioeconomic scale or their class or social position. So hopefully you're starting to see how this theory of articulation is much different than that older view. But anyway, let's just stop here again. I got a passage here in bold I just read to you. What do you make of that idea? Can you imagine ideology empowering people, enabling them to make sense or intelligibility of a historical situation without coming back to socioeconomics or class or social position? All right, so then he gives us some examples, and I'm always very happy when he gives some examples. He's got some great ones in these two chapters, but he comes back to religion again. And again, this is something in, what did Marx call it, the opiate of the masses. He seemed to have a simplistic view of it that unfortunately got adopted by later Marxists. But you notice Hall comes back to religion throughout this book with a very more nuanced view of its role. He says that it doesn't really have any necessary intrinsic transhistorical belongingness to it. It's just one of these ideological elements that can get articulated in all kinds of ways. That's not to say that it's not grooved, as he puts it. So it's got a sort of historical terrain that somewhat shapes, what you can do with it. But it's always being, I guess it's always changing, always shifting. Can play lots of different roles, different times for different people. And he says religion can help people construct some narrative to connect their past and the present, where they came from and where they are and where they're going to and why they are here. And he talks about the Rastafarians there, how I think he says they turned the Bible upside down in order to remake themselves as blacks in the New World. They became what they are. So I like this. This really shows you how articulation theory can be light years ahead, at least in my opinion, of the sort of classical Marxism. And they just say, well, we need to get rid of religion because it's the opiate of the masses. All it's doing is helping the dominant class stay in power by convincing all the workers to just keep on working because, when they die, they'll go to heaven. And that sort of very, very simplistic view is replaced here with, to me, almost infinitely more nuanced view. It's not necessary. I guess it could be an opiate of the masses, sure, but it could also be something empowering that people could take a hold of and articulate in a new way to actually, empower themselves, create a new subject position. So I think Hall's definitely correct on this. So he says it's not the individual elements of a discourse that have political or ideological connotations. It's the way those elements are organized together in a new discursive formation. So a social group has to see themselves reflected as a unified force in the ideology which constitutes them. The relationship between social forces and ideology is absolutely dialectical. As the ideological vision emerges, so does the group. So this, this seems to be a pretty profound thought. So if you think about the, what he's saying here about it being dialectical, how they depend on each other, that one doesn't create the other so much as they both sort of have to be there for either one to exist. And I think what is it? Is it Hegel where he talks about Hegel, who talks about the master-slave dialectic? How sort of the master and slave need each other to exist, because without the slave, you're not really a master. Without the master, you're not really a slave. Or you can't be a slave without a master, and so on. And so it sounds like that's what he's saying here about these social forces in the ideology. Can't have one without the other. He insists that the popular force of an organic ideology always depends on the social groups that can be articulated to and by it. And this is where we was talking a little bit about the rise of the Labour Party in Britain. But where he says here, such a force is not determined by socioeconomics, but the result of an articulation. I think we can use that idea to explain. I hate to delve into our sort of American politics and that situation, but I often hear people say things like, it's so weird to me that very poor people are taking positions that really just seem to defy what's good for them, right? They're sort of siding with very rich people when, whatever the legislation is that they're supporting will actually harm them economically speaking. So, how could it be that these groups are coming together? And I think something like articulation theory can really help us understand that sort of thing. And again, we could even look at religion coming into play there as one of those elements that might sort of drive these social groups together temporarily anyway, in ways that would be, really impossible if you're just thinking about socioeconomics and you just assume, the poor people, the workers, of course, are going to do what's good for them. They're going to vote for less taxes, let's say. on them and more taxes on the rich. Let's say something like that. However you want to figure it, but then it doesn't turn out that way. It's like, well, why didn't they act according to the quote unquote law? And maybe you can't really explain it economically. It just doesn't make sense. You have to bring in these other elements to understand how something like that can happen. Well, Hall talks about, and really, I think some of the best part of the books so far for me is he's talking about himself and I guess the sort of racial issues he deals with, his identity, and how it shifts depending on all these different contexts he finds himself in. So the position within the different signifying chains, what does it mean to be black? Not the literal fixed correspondences between an isolated term and some denotated position in the color spectrum. So instead, and again, I think if you just think about it for a few seconds, even it makes a lot of sense. Who are you? You're a lot of things, right? He says Hall's talking about himself here, but I think we've all felt this way. That no one interpolation exhausts us. There's no essential unitary I, only the fragmentary, contradictory subject I became. He says, he's talking about this on page 147. So, just what does it mean to be black, according to Hall, is not an easy question to answer, right? It's not just, there's not going to be a simplistic answer that's going to be true for that question. It's going to depend a lot on the context, and time, and the circumstances, all these articulations that can be affixed to it. This is interesting too. So this is over on page 148, talking about these ideological discourses. So he says, we're spoken by and spoken for in the ideological discourses which await us even at our birth, into which we are born and find our place. So for Hall, he was, I guess, black, I suppose, is one of these discourses that awaited him. But he says, however, the world neither divides neatly into these social natural categories, nor do the ideological categories necessarily produce their own appropriate, notice how he put the square quotes around that, modes of consciousness, because I don't think he believes there is an appropriate mode of consciousness for these categories. And there's no one size fits all, nor should there be. He says there's a complicated set of articulations between these two systems of discourse, and the relationship of equivalences is not fixed, but is changed historically. Nor is it determined by a single cause, but rather the result of an over determination. And we talked about that term last time. So really, I think the key, or the most important part of this chapter for me, and he gets into it in the next lecture as well, is that he wants to create a space for ideological struggle. It's not enough just to understand, analyze how all this is, what's happening, but what can we do about it? Where is the room to change the scenario? And he talks about that on page 152 a little bit. And so he says, a particular ideological chain becomes a site of struggle, not only when people try to displace, rupture, or contest it by supplanting it with some wholly new alternative set of terms, but also when they interrupt the ideological field and try to transform its meaning by changing or re-articulating its associations. And I think he was, I really grokked his example about black. And I think we see that clearly in American society as well, how that term, it's not like it's always this negative thing. It's changed a lot over time, and there's a lot of positive associations to that term. And we could apply that to all kinds of contested terms, I suppose, or labels, or whatever you want to use, and see how things can shift. So black exists ideologically only in relation to the contestation around those chains of meaning and the social forces involved in that contestation. I wonder what's the difference between contest and contestation. But anyway, I thought this, I really liked where he was talking about himself there and his experience. It kind of clarified, I think, or concretized a lot of the thought that he was talking about in the rest of the chapter. So before we jump into Lecture 7, I thought it'd be fun to think about your life, or maybe some labels that you've been associated with and might have changed in the course of your life, the sites of struggle. If you were basically, I guess I'll put it this way. So if you were kind of giving some examples from your life, the way that Hall was giving to talk about being Black in Jamaica, what would you want to talk about, and where do you see something similar happening in your life? Okay, so I'm going to jump into Lecture 7 here, and I won't say as much about this lecture as the other ones. I think there's a lot of great thought in this chapter for sure, but I think we sort of covered a lot of this in the other chapters, so I'll try to move relatively quickly here. So he does say he'll be relying on Antonio Gramsci for insights to broaden some of Althusser's anti-reductionist project. And by the way, we here at St. Cloud State, we have Rick Liebeck, who's a professor in English education. But he specialized in Gramsci, and I'm always stopping by his office to talk about Gramsci. So I think it'd be fun if you're ever in the Building 51 going through the offices and you see Rick Liebeck he's in his office a lot. I'm sure he'd be happy to go into Gramsci with you. He knows a lot more than I do about him, that's for sure. Okay, so one of the things that Hall says in here that I think is useful, and a lot of people say this too, they're talking about the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx and is it Engels, and says that, this book predicted that, just give it time and the workers will rise up, there'll be a revolution, and we'll be in that communist utopia. And of course that didn't happen. Instead, though, capitalism just got even more powerful. But Hall really made me stop and think here, because he says, it almost happened, right? And, these revolutions in Europe, it was a lot closer than people thought, or than people make out like it was. So that was just useful to me to think about that. I hadn't really realized how close it had been. Well, anyway, I guess it didn't happen. But he says the way that capitalism survived those revolutions was by articulating itself within new systems of representation. So it seems like, to me, in this chapter, Hall is really starting to apply his articulation theory to analyze some real stuff that happened in history and cultural shifts. So I really appreciated that. Anyway, he gets some background on Gramsci's pretty interesting stuff. I'll leave that for you to ponder. I do like this idea about Marxism needing updates. It's a kind of a living document, as it were. Wanted something more organic that could be more easily applied. So not taking Marx as some kind of gospel, really realizing that it needs to change with the times, I suppose. He also talks about relations of force instead of one-way relationships. I think we've kind of beaten that to death at this point about the superstructure and the structure model. So I think we can skip that a little bit. And he also continues the criticism that you can't just trace everything back to the economy. I hear Marxists even today talk about this, even to some extent on news shows, these commentary shows that are sort of ubiquitous on the cable news networks. A lot of times they'll say, well, who benefits from this? Who's really, these politicians are talking about immigration, let's say, and then let's reveal that they're really just doing it for money because it's better for their bottom line. Aha! So always follow the money. Or it's the economy, stupid. That sort of idea. And so Hall says, I guess Gramsci says that's not really true. It's really a lot more complicated than that. These crises are better explained as a result of changing relations and the balance of social forces. Let's move. I'm skipping some of this here. Now, this was kind of interesting too. So, a different way to think about class. So, I guess classical Marxists, you think about a working class, a bourgeoisie, dominant class, ruling class, whatever. He says here that the classes are not unified by default, rather, they are cross-cut by conflicting interests. Their unity has to be produced, constructed, created, articulated as a result of specific economic, political, and ideological practices. So again, I guess a class cohesion is not something that's intrinsic to that socioeconomic or whatever it is, but something that's a lot more fragile and temporary, tentative, if you will, that could always come apart in unpredictable ways. And hegemony, he really gets into this term. He says hegemony occurs when it encompasses the interests of other subordinate groups and begins to propagate itself throughout society, bringing about not only a unison of economic and political aims, but also intellectual and moral unity. The hegemony of a particular historical bloc is constituted by a process of the coordination between the dominant group's interests with the general interests of other groups and the life of the state as a whole. And those little moments will find collective will, otherwise not. And I think this next part was really helpful to me. I have to admit, I have often done this myself. But he says, at least according to Gramsci and I suppose Hall, hegemony and domination are not interchangeable. So no, I hear this all the time. People talking about hegemony precisely as if it was that older idea, the false consciousness, the ruling ideas, and you've been fooled, you've been sort of suckered into hegemony. You need to get out of that. Instead, we're talking about, I guess, a different definition of the word, different understanding of what hegemony really means. He says it's not something that everyone is incorporated into because they're mesmerized by media or these ideological forms. So this seems to be a pretty key insight. He says instead, hegemony has the capacity to actively contain, educate, and reshape oppositional forces to maintain them in their subordinate places. This is about subordination, not total incorporation. So hegemony is not the coercive power of the state or rule by the rich and powerful. Hegemony is periodic. It entails the formation of a bloc, not the appearance of a class. And these blocks require something like popular recognition and consent. So it's quite possible to rule without having this hegemony. And of course, we know that's true. You don't have to have any popular support whatsoever. So I thought I'd pause here and check with you. Before you read this, did you have a different idea of what hegemony meant? Did you think that these hegemony and domination were interchangeable? And has this altered your view? Then he talks more about the state. And the state is one of those terms that everybody, I guess, thinks they know perfectly well what we mean. We start talking about the state. But when you get down to try to nail down a definition, they're all over the place. Gramsci is calling it the instance which organizes the terrain of civil society. It is the point where the rule of an economic class is converted into political power. So the point where the rule of an economic class is converted into political power. It is where it becomes centralized and condensed, invested with the power and authority of the state itself. That make any sense to you? Well, let's move on. Often the primary agency through which cultural relations are organized and reorganized. So this regulatory function is the crucial thing to understand about what we mean by the state. So what is it not? So the state is not a coercive instrument of the ruling class. It is educative. It enlarges social and cultural possibilities. It enables people to enter new terrains. It is necessarily a contradictory site on which concessions have been won. So he gives some examples there of laws that have been passed that benefited, I guess, working people. Part of its concern is with public opinion in the sphere of civil society, which it cannot take hold of and manufacture directly, but which it organizes. So the state doesn't manufacture public opinion. I guess it was Chomsky that wrote that book, Manufacturing Consent. So I guess what we're talking here about, it doesn't do that. It doesn't necessarily take hold of it, manufacture it directly, but nevertheless it organizes it. So let's think about that. What could that mean? It is articulated to the dominant social forces, the dominant ideological systems, and the dominant class positions in the economy. So it is articulated at all those things, connected, but it is not simply controlled by the capitalist classes. In fact, it requires, so I think that's really a key term there, it requires a degree of separation, specificity, and relative autonomy from the direct play of classical class contradictions if it is to perform its many and diverse functions. Classes are formed in relation to the state. They do not appear before it already unified with their program in hand. So quite a lot going on here. So I think this would be a good pause again for us to ponder this. So what do you think about this idea that while the state is articulated to all these dominant systems and forces and positions, it's nevertheless not controlled directly by it. And matter of fact, requires a degree of separation, specificity, and relative autonomy. Just what do you make of what Gramsci and Hall are talking about here? And do you agree or disagree with it? All right, so moving on, not much more to go here, but some more key ideas I didn't want to skip. I like this. I love this part of where he's talking about Gramsci and ideology having two floors, philosophy and common sense. And so philosophy here means the specialized and coherent philosophical elaboration. So, liberalism or I was watching a documentary about North Korea, and I wish I had written the term down, but there's a sort of a state philosophy that everyone ascribes to. And in the documentary that I'll see if I can find it and remember to put it in the notes for you, but they're basically saying this philosophy, they call it a philosophy, but it's really not very coherent. But nevertheless, I guess it's, the idea that somebody has thought all this out and laid out this philosophical framework and articulated everything. But anyway, we can think about any philosophy. And so it says that, but that's just sort of one floor. For that to work at all, you got this great philosophy that you've come out with, you think would be great for society and culture. Well, who cares? It doesn't really matter unless it enters into, modifies, and transforms the practical, everyday consciousness of the masses. In other words, it moves from philosophy into becoming a common sense. So again, it's a really interesting idea. How I guess something that's just kind of philosophy, maybe if something of interest to thinkers, becomes common sense. We sort of forget, the origins in philosophy over time. He says common sense is important because more coherent ideologies and philosophies must contend with it for mastery. Which, what is that other part he talks about in here about the history, having the nightmares of history kind of sticking with us. A lot of times it seems that change is needed, but we sort of know the change is needed on a philosophical level or maybe a scientific level. But the common sense rejects the notion, right? Sort of revolts against it. So you're arguing with common sense. And I think the key here is not to say, well, they're wrong, but rather to sort of have that, again, that more nuanced view, trying to avoid that simplistic right and wrong or good and bad ideas, and see it instead as more of a, well, let's look at what he says here. So every philosophy current leaves behind a sedimentation of common sense. This is the document of its historical effectiveness. So I think that's a key insight. I was trying to trying to articulate it in other words, but I think it's said perfectly well here. So again, this common sense that you're looking at and saying, well, that's wrong. But I think what you want to think about it instead is, well, it became common sense because historically it was effective. At some point it worked well, and that's why it has become part of this sediment. So it's no wonder it's going to be difficult to overcome some of these beliefs, right? No matter, you might have a great philosophy, great science, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to overturn common sense overnight. On the other hand, common sense is not fixed, but continually transforming. And of course, we have countless examples, ideas that at one time, well, that's just common sense. It's just common sense that we need slaves in the economy to function. I'm sure that was common sense so long ago. Of course, nowadays it's common sense that slavery is evil and horribly counterproductive. So Gramsci's key insight, according to Hall, is focus on popular thought. So political education and cultural politics need to renovate and clarify the confused constructions of popular thought. So, really popular thought could be all over the place, right? So if you want to reform, one way to think about this is renovating and clarifying all these constructions. And again, you could make an articulation with religion. I'm thinking, you could think of religion as a problem to overcome, or you could think about a people's religion as, something you could connect to, you could connect your program with, and be a lot more successful than just seeing it as something to be overcome. He also is talking about subjects again. So he says, Gramsci refuses any idea of a pre-given, unified ideological subject. Instead, there's a plurality of selves, a personality strangely composite. We can think one thing and do something else. He says, that's not necessarily self-deception. I guess you shouldn't necessarily feel guilty about this. You could have a philosophy and you act against it. Now, there are, of course, critics of these ideas. There's a whole lecture series I watched called the Attack on the Self. It was exactly taking issue with this idea that that we don't have a coherent self, and instead we're sort of fragmented deep inside. So I just put that out there. Not saying Hall has the last word on all these ideas. Gramsci says questions of ideology are always collective and social, not individual. So that makes sense given his earlier idea about individuals. There's never just one single, unified, coherent, dominant ideology which pervades everything. Likewise, they're not spontaneously born in the brain. They don't pop out of nowhere. They renovate and make critical an already existing activity. And at one point he says, well, how could you do this? How could you renovate it and make critical? And he says, this is the job of criticism. Criticism makes possible a process of differentiation and change in the relative weight that the elements of the old ideologies used to possess. So I think the key here is thinking about renovation rather than destruction or recreation, right? It's I guess the idea, nothing new under the sun, but that doesn't mean there can't be change, because you can always take what's under the sun and rearrange it in different configurations. So hegemony allows for the space in which subordinate and excluded peoples develop political practices in social spaces of their own. They can have their own space within the subordinate positions. Hegemony is about leadership and not only about domination. So I thought that was an interesting idea. There he was talking, I forget his example, but you could have, I guess, people coming together into hegemonies without becoming all one people or one class, and they could sort of maintain a lot of difference. They could still be subordinate and excluded in many ways, but still have a place within the hegemony. He says hegemony never happens without coercion, simply because on the face of it, every state has a police force. However, it's never pure coercion either. As a matter of fact, if there's too much police force, again, going back to Althusser, if there's too much repression, if the cops are everywhere and there's soldiers in the streets and all this, that means there's a real crisis, right? And it's probably a sign that the state's about to break down, more so than show of strength. Because maintaining hegemony is difficult work. So these little articulations that might come together, again, it could be a very temporary thing, and some of them do just go away really quickly, whereas very few, I think, hold together for long enough to make a real change. So Gramsci says we must give people the capacity to make the necessary calculations in their own idioms, languages, and everyday life. And so I think this point here is one of the things that gets lost a lot of the time. Even if you look at the history of Marxism and socialism, you think about the Soviet Revolution, and I guess all these Marxists going out into the farms and trying to force a whole new idiom and a way of life onto people that were in no way prepared for it, and just complete disaster, right? In so many ways, it was really sad what happened there. And this was precisely what happened, was people did not have or weren't given the capacity to make these calculations using their own idioms, languages, and life. In 19th century Britain, everyone could fit into liberalism, but this changed due to economic upheaval as well as those ideological representations. And he was talking there about how Britain went from sort of the economic powerhouse, this sort of dominant world power, after its empire fell apart, and I guess America rose and sort of took over the world economy and all this stuff. He says you could use articulation theory to understand this change better. And then he talks here, and this is the end of the chapter, about victory. So how do you win the struggle? He says victory is the seizing of the balance of power on every front of struggle. To win, you can't ignore culture, intellectual, and moral spaces. So he was talking about Thatcherism, which I'm not sure how familiar. I'm not super familiar with that, not having grown up in Britain. But I think we could see in our own politics and culture how, what party you affiliate with or what party you're a member of. It's not just strictly politics, right? Instead, it infuses itself into, all manner of things: the shows you watch, the books you read, thoughts on morality. It seems to have something to say in all these different arenas, and that's what allows it to be victorious, I suppose. And say a movement that was just intellectual isn't going to go very far in terms of hegemony, right? Because it's too narrow. And I like this ending here. So the notion that this has nothing to do with culture, is outside of ideology, or is really dictated by the position in the class structure, is absolutely absurd. So in other words, the very idea that we can just talk about hegemony and ideology just by reference to that. The means of production is absolutely absurd. So I like the way he ended this chapter. I'm running out of steam. I bet you are. Hopefully I clarified, or at least didn't make this more confusing than it may have been already. But anyway, I'll leave it here. If you've got any questions, comments, suggestions, whatever, feel free to leave those in the box. Otherwise, just put no or no thanks or whatever. And I'll see you next time.